Today's story is about one of the deadliest acts of violence in American history, an event that happened nearly a century ago in a tiny Michigan village, and a man whose plan almost no one saw coming. On the morning of May 18, 1927, more than 300 children walked through the front doors of a school in a tiny farming village in Michigan. Most of them were between 7 and 12 years old. They hung up their coats, found their seats, pulled out their school books. It was a Wednesday, an ordinary Wednesday by all accounts. And then, at exactly 8:45 in the morning, the ground beneath their feet erupted. What followed was not just one of the most devastating events in American history. It remains, to this day, the deadliest attack on a school ever carried out on U.S. soil, and almost nobody has ever heard of it. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of twisted, chilling, and deeply disturbing stories delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's medicine cabinet and replace all their allergy pills with tiny, harmless pebbles. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early 1920s, the village of Bath, Michigan was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. It was a farming community of maybe 300 people, about 10 miles northeast of Lansing, the state capital, though you'd never have known you were that close to a capital city. There was a grain elevator, a small drugstore, and a church. Everyone knew everyone. Families had lived there for generations. In 1922, the township did something that was a big deal for a little place like this. They voted to build a proper consolidated school. One modern building that would replace all the scattered one-room schoolhouses across the area, giving every kid from 1st grade through 12th grade a real education under one roof. It cost money, obviously. It required a new property tax, and most of the community was okay with that. Most. One man was not okay with it. And that man was Andrew Kehoe. Andrew Kehoe was 55 years old in the spring of 1927. He had grown up as one of 13 children in Tecumseh, Michigan, and had eventually made his way to Bath, where he and his wife Nellie purchased a 185-acre farm in 1919. By all outward appearances, he was a serious, capable man. He'd taken electrical engineering courses at Michigan State College. Neighbors described him as highly intelligent, meticulous, almost obsessively so. He was known to change his shirt if it got even slightly dirty during farm work. He could fix anything. He could wire a building, service a tractor, repair a boiler, but there was something else about Andrew Kehoe that the people of Bath had picked up on over the years. He was the kind of man who could not tolerate being disagreed with. He was cruel to his animals. A neighbor once watched him beat a horse to death in a fit of rage. He argued with everyone on the school board about the cost of running the school. He fought with neighbors. He refused to pay the local church's membership fee, and then wouldn't let his wife Nellie attend services at all. And underneath that neat, controlled exterior, there was something dark. There had been a moment years earlier, before Bath, before Nellie, that some of his oldest neighbors had quietly never forgotten. When Kehoe was around 14 years old, his stepmother came home one afternoon and went to light the kitchen stove. The stove had been tampered with. It exploded, drenching her in burning oil. Andrew stood there and watched her burn. Eventually, he picked up a bucket of water and threw it on her, which made the oil fire worse. She died from her injuries. Nothing was ever officially proven, but people who knew the family believed Andrew had done it. That was who Andrew Kehoe was. After he and Nellie settled in Bath, Kehoe worked his way onto the township school board and eventually became its treasurer. This meant he had formal authority over the school's finances, and he used that position to fight, constantly and furiously against every expenditure. He hated the school, not because the school was doing something wrong, but because the taxes that funded it were squeezing his farm, which he was already badly mismanaging. He wasn't farming it the way it needed to be farmed. He'd stopped following traditional practices, tried to do everything with his tractor, and was falling further and further behind on his mortgage. The bank had begun foreclosure proceedings, and so in his mind, the school became the thing that was destroying him. The school and the taxes and the people who voted for it. In the spring of 1926, Kehoe ran for Bath Township clerk. It was a small local election, but he wanted it badly. He lost. And according to his neighbor, a man named Monty Ellsworth, who would later write a book about what happened, that defeat was the moment something inside Andrew Kehoe finally snapped all the way. Ellsworth believed Kehoe decided right then, in April of 1926, that he was going to destroy the school, and he was going to start planning immediately. What followed was 13 months of methodical, patient, invisible preparation. Kehoe had one major advantage: he was still on the school board, and as a licensed electrician and handyman who had done repair work at the school, he had regular, unsupervised access to the building, including its basement. During the summer of 1926, he spent hours alone in the lower floors of that school. To anyone watching, he was just doing maintenance work. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked twice. He was quietly installing hundreds of pounds of explosives. Farmers in those days commonly used dynamite to blast tree stumps from their fields. Kehoe had purchased large quantities of it legally over the years, and he supplemented that with pyritol, a surplus World War I explosive that the government was selling cheaply after the war. Pound by pound, over months, he smuggled it into the school and packed it under the floorboards. He wired it all together with his electrician's skill. He set it to detonate using an alarm clock timer. And then he waited. He kept showing up to school board meetings. He kept arguing about budgets. He kept smiling politely at the superintendent, a man named Emery Huick, even though Huick knew about the foreclosure and the two of them had a quietly contentious relationship. Nobody suspected anything. Meanwhile, back at his farm, Kehoe had essentially stopped farming altogether. Neighbors noticed. He gave one of his horses away. He cut the fences. He girdled the young shade trees around the property, killing them slowly so they'd look dead but wouldn't look freshly cut. He was preparing to destroy his own farm, too. He was leaving nothing behind. By the time May of 1927 arrived, Nellie Kehoe had become very ill, something resembling tuberculosis, and had just returned home from a hospital stay on May 16th. 2 days later, sometime before dawn on May 18th, Andrew Kehoe murdered her. He moved her body to one of the farm outbuildings and set the incendiary charges on the farm buildings, set to go off that morning. Then he went into town. At around 8:30 that morning, he was seen in Bath mailing a package, looking perfectly calm. A school trustee who crossed paths with him even asked if he could come by the school to check on the boiler. Kehoe said he'd be along shortly. At 8:45 a.m., the alarm clock in the basement of Bath Consolidated School's North Wing triggered. The explosion tore through the North Wing like the building was made of paper. Entire classrooms simply ceased to exist. The roof collapsed inward. Children who had been sitting at their desks one second were buried under rubble the next. Teachers who survived ran toward the sound of screaming to dig through the debris with their bare hands. Parents who worked nearby came sprinting. The rescue operation began in chaos and horror, people using ropes to try to lift sections of collapsed roof, pulling children out by their arms, covered in plaster dust and blood. It was into this scene, this desperate, frantic rescue operation, that Andrew Kehoe drove up in his truck about 30 minutes later. Witnesses who saw him approach said he looked calm, almost serene. One man said Kehoe was smiling broadly enough that you could see both rows of his gold teeth. Some people who saw him pulling up thought he had come to help. After all, he was on the school board. He knew everything about this building. Superintendent Huick was in the middle of coordinating the rescue when Kehoe pulled up. Huick approached the truck. He asked Kehoe for help, said they needed to get ropes and equipment and could Kehoe's truck carry some of it. Kehoe said, "Sure, climb in." Huick was about to step up into the cab when something made him stop. He looked at Kehoe's face, and then, according to witnesses, Huick's expression changed. He said to Kehoe, "You know something about this, don't you?" Kehoe raised his rifle and fired into the back seat of his own truck. The truck had been packed floor to ceiling with dynamite, nails, bolts, scraps of metal, everything Kehoe could find to turn it into a weapon. The explosion killed Kehoe, killed Superintendent Huick, killed 3 other people standing nearby, and sent shrapnel tearing through the crowd of parents and rescuers. An 8-year-old boy named Cleo Clayton, who had survived the school bombing and been pulled from the rubble, was killed by shrapnel from the truck. When investigators went through the wreckage of the school in the days that followed, they found something that stopped them cold. In the south wing of the building, the wing that had not exploded, they discovered more than 500 pounds of unexploded dynamite and pyritol, still wired and ready. Kehoe had intended to bring down the entire school, every classroom, every child. The south wing charges had simply failed to detonate. And when investigators went to what remained of the Kehoe farm, they found one more thing. Wired to a fence post near the property line was a small hand-painted sign. It said, "Criminals are made, not born." When the dust settled, 38 children were dead, all of them between 7 and 14 years old. 2 teachers were killed. The superintendent was gone. In total, 44 people died from the attacks, with a 45th victim, a little girl named Beatrice Gibbs, dying 3 months later following surgery for her injuries. At least 58 more were wounded. The story consumed the front pages of newspapers all across America for 5 days. And then, on May 23rd, Charles Lindbergh landed in Paris after completing the first solo transatlantic flight in history. The Bath school disaster disappeared from the headlines almost overnight, buried under the celebration. Andrew Kehoe was buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave in the paupers section of a cemetery in Clinton County. His wife, Nellie, was buried under her maiden name by her family in a separate cemetery in Lansing. They did not bury them together. The Bath Consolidated School was eventually demolished and replaced by a new building funded by a $75,000 personal check from a United States senator. That school was torn down in 1975. Today, on the original site, there is a small park. In the center of it stands the cupola that once sat on the roof of the school, the only piece of the original building that was salvaged. It is the deadliest attack on a school in the history of the United States, and most people have never heard of it. And that's going to do it for today's story. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's medicine cabinet and replace all their allergy pills with tiny, harmless pebbles. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or X. My username is the same on both. It's The Midnight Casebook. If you have a story suggestion, please leave a comment. So, whether I see you on Instagram, X, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See you next time.